Hey everyone, my name is Maxim Ivanov, and in this video we're going to build a CRUD application, a library book storing app using React Query version 3. First of all, let me show you the final result. Here is the app. We have a list of books. We can add new books here. Title, some book by some author. Submit. You see a nice preloader here, a nice preloader there, and it's here in the list now. We can edit this book. Some book becomes some other book. Submit. Here you go, it's updated, and you can remove the item. Boom. So if you're not subscribed yet, do it now, press a like button, and let's go. So we're gonna create a CRUD application using React and React Query version 3. And we already have an API using Node.js, and it's documented using Swagger. Don't worry, I'm gonna provide you with this server. The link will be in the description. And if you wanna know how to write and document your API server using Swagger, then let me know in the comments. Here we have a library API. You can see that we have a bunch of endpoints. We can get a list of all the books. We can try it out right here in the browser. If I press execute, it will actually perform the request and we'll get a response with the books that we currently have in our library. Then we can also get info for a particular book. Let's copy an ID, for example, this one. Copy. And then we press try it out, paste the book ID, and press execute. And we get this particular book description. Then we can also update the book by its ID. Let's try to update the previous book, paste the ID. And then let's say we just add a bunch of pluses. Press execute. And the book was updated. If we refetch the list of the books, let's clear it and execute again. You will see that one of them, the one that we've edited, has now pluses in the author name. We can also create new books. There is a post handle, post, and then we press try it out. Let's remove the ID. It's going to be generated automatically. And let's call it test test. The title is test and the author is going to be test as well. Execute. We got the new book. We have an ID now. If we fetch the list of the books, it's going to be in this list somewhere. Yeah, it's here in the bottom. And we can also remove this book. Delete. Try it out. Let's paste the ID and press execute. This book was removed. And if we fetch the list of the books, you will see that it's not there anymore. It was removed. Let's begin by creating a new React application. I'm going to be using create React app, npx create React app, and I'm going to call it client. After it's done, we switch to the client folder, cd client, and open the code editor. First of all, we'll need to install a bunch of dependencies. First of all, I'm going to install React Query because that's a tutorial about the React Query library, right? So I install yarn add React Query. We'll also need something to implement the navigation between pages. I'm going to be using React Router DOM. React Router DOM. We're going to be using React Hook Form to handle the forms in our application. So React Hook Form. Also, I'll need to style the app, and I'm going to be using Rebase for this application. I'm going to install Rebase and also Rebase Forms and Rebase Preset for theming. I'm also going to install styled components. Here I also use them for theming. And finally, I'm going to use React Loader Spinner for animated loaders. React Loader Spinner. After it's done and you have all the dependencies, you have Rebase Forms, Rebase Preset, React Hook Form, React Loader Spinner, React Query, Router DOM, Rebase, and styled components, we can begin working on our application. And first I'm going to remove a bunch of files. I'm going to remove test because it's going to become irrelevant very soon. I'm going to remove the logo, and I'm also going to remove the app.css file. Boom. Then we go to index.js and perform the initial setup. First of all, let's import the browser router from React Router DOM. Browser router from React Router DOM. And we wrap our application into it. Browser router. Next, we'll need the theme provider, and we'll get it from the styled components. import theme provider from styled components. We're going to use it with the preset from Rebus. Import preset from Rebus preset. And now we wrap our application into it. Theme provider, theme equals preset, and then a closing tag. Format the document. And finally, we prepare the React query. We'll need to import query client provider and the query client itself from React query. And then wrap our application into it. Query client provider. And then we specify the client. Before we can do it, we need to instantiate it. So we create a const query client equals new query client. And now we can pass it as a prop. Query client. Query client is an object that allows you to interact with your cache. We'll actually use it once when we'll need to clear the books cache, when we'll remove the book, and we'll need to refresh the list of the books on the page. And the query client provider is a provider that makes your query client accessible across the whole application. Now, before we move on, we'll also need to import the styles for the React loader spinner. Let's do it. Import React loader spinner, dist loader CSS, React spinner loader CSS. And now we should be all set up. Let's go to app.js and plan our routes. First of all, remove the imports and then remove all the layout. Now we need to import the switch component, import switch, and also the route component from the React router DOM. Route from React router DOM. Let's go to the app component, use the switch. This component allows you to render the routes exclusively. So if the first of them matches, then only this route will be rendered. And first we'll define the root route. Route path root and a closing tag. And inside of it we'll render the books list component. The books list component is a page, so I'm gonna create a folder for it. New folder, books list. Inside of it, I'm gonna create a new file, also called bookslist.jsx, and I'm also gonna create an index file, index.js. This file will make it easier to access the books list component and kind of harder, or the default level of hardness, to access the books list specific components. For example, we'll use the book item to represent the book in the list, and we don't want this component to be used on any other pages. So we'll make it easier to use the books list by export everything from the books list module, from this module. And here we'll export a new component, export const books list equals a function, and for now we return nothing. Let's go back to the app and import the books list component. Import books list from books list. And as you can see, I'm importing from the kind of folder itself. And I can do this only because I have this index.js file that re-exports the entities, in our case the component, from the books list module. So I don't have to write books list / books list, even though I can. But in my case, I don't want to do this, and it's intentional, so that if I ever see that someone on some other page is trying to use ... to get one folder up, and then books list and then some component from it, then I know that something is going wrong, and some other page, instead of using the shared files, is trying to use the specific files components from another module. And this is what I want to avoid here. So I'm gonna have a convention in this app that if you want to import something from a specific page, you do it like this. And if it's not exported from the index, then you're not supposed to use it. And let's continue. Let's format the document. And then we define another route. We'll need a route to create a book. Let's define it. Route path. Let's call it create /create book. Then we add a closing tag, route. And inside of it, we use a component called create book. Again, it's a page, so I think it deserves its own folder. New folder, create book. Same as with the book list, I create a file called createbook.jsx and an index file, index.js. I create a component and export it. Export const create book equals a function that returns nothing for now. Return null. And inside of the index file, I export everything from createbook. I import the createbook component from the createbook module. And now we define our last route, which is update book. I'm gonna copy this part of the layout, change the create to update, and change the create to update here as well. Update. And I repeat the process. Create a new folder, update book. Inside of it I create a new file, update book.jsx, and an index file, index.js. Export everything from update book. And I import this component, import update book, from the update book module. All right, we have the navigation structure and we have the folder for each of the pages. I like this structure because this way, when you open the folder for this particular page, you can see what files does it have. And if you have the test files, they will be in the same folder along with the component itself. So for example, for create book, there would be another file called create book spec or test.jsx. And it's just nice because you immediately see that some of the components are not tested. By the way, in this tutorial, we're not going to write the tests for the components. But if you would like to see a tutorial on how to test each of those components and test the whole application, then write a comment below this video. And I'm going to do it next time. Let's remove the file for now. And next thing we do, we create a shared folder because we are going to have a bunch of shared components. For example, here above the switch, I want to have a navigation bar. I'm going to use a fragment to wrap all the elements. And then here I want to have a nav bar. And it will go to the shared folder. Let's create a new folder, shared, and we create a new file here, navbar.jsx. Here we export a const called navbar, which is a function. And here we return actually something. We're going to return the navbar layout. And I'm going to use components from the rebas. It's going to help me quite a lot because they're already styled and it's going to save me a bunch of time. So before we begin, let's actually import those components. Import, I'm going to use flex component. It's a container with the display flex set by default. We're going to use a box, that's the default container in rebas. We're going to use a link, but we're also going to be using links from the React Router DOM inside of this component. So I'm going to rename it to a styled link. Link as styled link. And I'm also going to be using an image component for a logo in the top left corner. And we import it from rebas styled components. You can use the default versions, which are meant to be used with the emotion styling system. But as I've used the theme provider from the styled components, I need to use the styled components imports. Next, we're going to import the link component from the React Router DOM. That's what I was talking about. And the names, they overlap. This is why I renamed the styled link. Link from React Router DOM. Now let's start working on the layout. The topmost component is going to be the flex. It's going to have BG black. Color is going to be a font color white. And justify content is going to be center. We're going to center the elements here. Next, we add another flex container that will contain our elements. It's going to have the padding 2. It's going to have width 100%. And it's going to have the align items property center. Now inside of it, we're going to use a link. And this one is from React Router DOM. And we're going to set the component of this link to be the styled link from the rebas variant nav. And the link component will propagate this, all other props, to the styled link component that we're using here. Variant nav and to the root route. This link will say React query CRUD. Then we'll use the box. It's going to be a spacer, margin horizontal, mx equals auto. So it will take the horizontal space between the React query CRUD link and the create new book or add new book link on the right. Actually, I'm gonna copy the previous link. I don't like to type. Link component styled link. The URL will be create book. And the text should be plus add new book. And actually we forgot to close the box tag. Actually now is a good time to test if everything works. Let's make sure that we've imported the navbar inside of the app component, which we did not do. So we do import navbar from shared navbar. And the shared folder is the only one where I'm gonna allow, or I'm gonna expect that people will use specific imports. Now let's launch the app, yarn start. Open the browser and that's what you should see. You should see the link to the root route and the link to the create book route. Nothing else should be shown on the screen because we didn't implement those pages, but at least the navbar is here. Before we move on, I'm gonna create another component that is gonna limit the width of our application. It's gonna be a container. And let's do it now. And also I'm gonna use the icon for the React query to make the app look nicer. Let's do it. Inside the shared folder, create a new file, call it container.jsx. Inside of it, we import the box from the rebus. And as we're using styled components to provide the theme, we need to use the styled components import. Now we export the container component. Export const container equals a function. And here we return a simple layout with a box. We actually need to get the children from the props because it's going to be a wrapping component. We render the children inside of the box, and this box is going to have some styles based on the theme. So we pass an object as an SX prop width 100%, max width 1024, and margin horizontal MX auto. Now we go back to navbar. We import our container component, import container from container. And then right inside the outermost flexbox container, we add our container component. Container, and here we add the closing tag for it. Format the document. And now let's add the icon. I'm gonna copy the icon from another project, CP, React Query 3, client, SRC, shared, logo SVG, and we copy it to SRC, shared. Now inside of the navbar, we import logo from logo SVG. And here is this file. Before the React Query CRUD link, we add an image, size 20, SRC, logo, and a closing tag, no, closing slash. I'm gonna launch the app again. And then after we open it in the browser, we should see the icon and everything should be centered. Now let's continue with the books list page. Open the books list component. And here we're gonna start working with React Query. Let's import a bunch of things. First of all, we need to import the use query hook. Use query. Use query is used to fetch the data. Use query from React query. And when you call it, you get a bunch of things. We're interested in data that we're gonna fetch, an error if something wrong happens, the flag for the loading status that is called isLoading, and the flag for an error, which is called isError. Let's define the constants for them. Data, error, isLoading, and isError equals use query. And our cache, the item in cache that we're gonna be refreshing later, should be called books. And to fetch them, we're gonna use the function called getAllBooks. It needs to be a function that returns a promise and can get the params from the use query. This particular one doesn't need any params, but we need to define it inside of the API module. Let's create it inside of the SRC folder, create the api.js. I like to abstract the data fetching functions, so I'm not bound to specific implementation. And my components don't know if I use some library like Axios, or I use the fetch API, or I use something else. Doesn't matter. I can easily change to something different. So here we export a function getAllBooks. It's an async function, async. And inside of it, we first get the response equals await fetch. And then we need to use the URL. I could use it directly here and say HTTP localhost 4000 because my server is running on port 4000 and then books. But to make it easier to configure your app and later use in production if you want to, it's better to have a .env file which will store our configuration items. Let's create a new file in the root of your project along with gitignore, package.json, and so on. Create new file, call it .env, and Create React App supports the .env files by default. You need to prefix all the properties there with React App. So for example, if we want to create a property called API server, then it's going to be called React App API server. And here we'll store the URL, HTTP, localhost, and port 4000. Now we can use this property, this attribute, inside of the API module. Instead of using it directly here, we remove everything up until the slash. We switch to template string. And here we use a placeholder and we get the value from the process env React App API server. Good. Okay, now we have the response from the server, but we need to parse it as a JSON. But before we do it, we need to check if the response was 200, if it had the status 200, which means that it was performed successfully. To do this, we can actually check the OK flag on the response. We do it like this. If not response OK, then we throw a new error and we say something went wrong. Otherwise, if everything is okay, we return response.json. It's a function that transforms the response value, which is a string, to a JSON because we expect a JSON response from our server. Now let's get back to the book list and import the getAllBooks function. Import getAllBooks from API. Now we can work on our layout. For example, we know that if the status is loading, then we need to show the preloader, the spinner. And we do it by making an early return. We check if is loading, then we return a special layout for this case. I'm gonna reuse the container, import container from shared container. It's gonna be a wrapper container. Inside of it, we use a flex container. We need to import it from the rebus. Import flex from rebus styled components. And then we add a closing flex. And inside of this flex block, we'll have our loader. It's going to be an animated spinner. And we import it, import loader from React loader spinner. The loader should have the type 3 dots. Color, it should be a light gray color. I'm going to use CCC. And the height should be 30. And let's close it. Now the flex should have padding vertical, PY, 5, and justify content should be center. Format the document. And we have the loading state. That's good. Now we need to process the error. If something goes wrong, if is error, then we return. And let's just return a message. For now, just a span, which will say error and then error message. Now, if it's not loading and not error, then we return the regular layout, which is a list of books. We're going to use the component again to wrap everything. Container. Inside of it, we have a flex with flex direction column because we want to position the items vertically, and align items should be center. Here, we're going to map through the data. It's going to be an array that we're getting from the server. You can verify it in the Swagger documentation. You see, we get an array of items. So we use data, map, and for each of the items, we get author, which is spelled differently, a title, and an ID. As you can see, each of them has an author, a title, and an ID field. Then we return. I'm using round brackets to not use the return statement. This way I can just state that it should be a, for now let's use a div, and then we'll create a separate component. Each div here should have a key because we're iterating through the array, and React requires you to use the key so it knows which element is which. So the key should be ID, and then inside of it we're gonna say author dash title, and for now it's okay, I guess. Let's make sure that we're running our client. go to the browser, reload the page, go to the root, and something is wrong. Let's see what did we get from the server. If we open network, reload the page, we got books 304, and the response was, whoa, we've used the wrong server address. Let's go to env, localhost 4000, okay, should be correct, but here I'm using 3000. Maybe I should relaunch the app. Okay, and now we don't get any response because the server is not running. Let's open the server in another tab. cd workspace, react query CRUD 3, cd server yarn start. I didn't reload the page, and React Query refetched the data automatically. That's one of the cool things about it. By default, it tries to refetch the data whenever you leave the window, when you leave the tab and get back to it. Let's close the console. Okay, we have all our books rendered, but we want them to look nicer. So let's define a book item component for them. Go back to the app. Inside of the book list page, we create another component, new file, book item.jsx. And now I'm not gonna re-export it from the index. So it's gonna be a bit harder to use it in other components. Let's define the book item here. Export const book item equals a function. For now, let's return null. And we need a bunch of imports. Import flex, text, button, and a link as styled link, just like we did for the navbar, because we're going to be using the link from React Router DOM as well. We import them from rebus styled components. Then we import the link, import link from React Router DOM. Now instead of null, let's return a flex, inside of which we're going to render a text that will say the author name, which we'll get from the props author, along with the title and the ID. Let's add a link. The component should be styled link, just like in navbar. Component equals styled link. The to should be a template string, update book. It's going to lead us to the book editing page, update book, and this page needs an ID. By the way, did we implement this route? No, we didn't do it completely. So if you need to work with segments, so you pass some data in the URL segment, like we want to do here, you can use the colon ID, and this ID will be accessible inside of that update book page through the hooks provided through React Router DOM. So now it should be okay. Let's go back to the book item, and now we can have another part of the URL here, which will be the ID of the book. And the text of the link will be the title of the book. We also add the margin right, which should be auto. Let's format the document, add a button, and this button is not going to do anything for now. It's just going to say remove. We're going to implement this a little bit later. And before we move on, let's add the padding 3 width 100% and align items center. That should do it for now. Let's go back to the books list, import the book item from the book item module. And now instead of the div, we're going to be using our book item component. Book item, author, title, key, ID. And we also need to pass the ID, and we pass the ID as an ID prop. And we close the tag. All right, let's go to the browser. Everything looks okay. I would say the button needs a little bit of left margin. Let's go back. Book item, button, ml equals 5. And now it should be okay. Yeah, looks fine now. So we have a list of the books, and we potentially would like to remove them. If we click the remove button, now nothing happens. And we could do it using the mutations. So in React Query, queries are a way to fetch the data, and mutations are the way to update the data on the backend. Let's go back to the app. And inside of the book item, we're going to import the use mutation and the use query client from React Query. Now we can define the mutation function. We're going to be using mutate async. That's one of the ways to use the mutation function. If you go to the docs and check out the API reference for the use mutation, you will see that we get a bunch of values here. We get the data as well, if the fetching function will actually return the value from the server. the error, the flags, if we got an error, if it's loading or idle or paused. The difference is that the idle state is before we fetch, the isLoading is when we are in the process of fetching, and is paused if we post the mutation. And we also get two mutate and mutate async functions. Mutate is a synchronous function. The mutate function is synchronous, and if you need to do something after you've mutated your values, you will need to use the onSuccess handle, which you can pass to useMutation inside of the options object. In our case, we'll want to refresh the books cache after we successfully remove the book or perform the mutation. So it's easier to do it, or at least for me, I like it more, using the mutate async function, which will allow us to perform this function using the async await syntax, and after we do it, clean up the cache. Let's do it now. So we get the mutate async, and we'll also need to get the isLoading status, and we get them from the use mutation. You need to pass the mutator function to it, and in our case it's going to be the remove book function that will also define in the api.js. Inside of the api.js module, export new constant called remove book, which is an async function that receives an ID, and then it gets the response using the await fetch. Here we use the environment property again, process env react app API server /books/id, the one that we got from the arguments. And then we need to pass an options object to the fetch function. The only option we need to pass here is the method, the HTTP method, and it's delete. After it's done, we can check if not response awk, then we throw new error with the message from response JSON message, because I expect that in this case the server will return the object with an error that will have a message field, and if everything is fine, we just return true. We don't need any data. Now let's get back to the book item. Import remove book from the API module. Now let's define the removal function. Const remove equals an async function where we'll await for the mutate async to perform. Mutate async, we pass an ID here. We get the ID from the props. So the component, the book item component, is aware of its ID. And then we need to clear the cache or invalidate queries for the cache item books. Let's get the query client. Const query client equals use query client without the extra T. And then we call query client invalidate queries, and we invalidate the books because inside of the book list we are using the books query. So after we call the invalidate queries for the books, the cache will be cleaned up, and it will force the books list to refetch the data. Now that we have the remove function, we can use it as a non-click handler on our button. On click, remove. You probably wonder, why do we need the isLoading flag? We need it to show the loading spinner when we click the remove, and it didn't happen. So the server I'm using for this app is intentionally slow. It has a delay of 1 second for each of the responses. You might have noticed it when we were using the Swagger documentation to check the routes. So instead of just remove, we're going to have a JavaScript expression here. And if we are loading, then we return a loader, which we get from the React Loader Spinner library. Import loader from React Loader Spinner. And it should be 3 dots as well. 3 dots. Color should be white, FFF, and height should be 10. And we close this tag. Otherwise, if we are not loading, it should actually say remove. And we are good. Let's go to the documentation and let's actually create a new book. We already have the test here, and we can execute it again. You see there was a 1 second delay. We got the new book. If we go to the app, it was loaded automatically. We can click remove, and it was removed. Now, the 2 screens that are left are to create new books and update them. And both of them are going to use the same form. So let's start with this form first. As it's going to be used by 2 pages, I'm going to put it inside of the shared folder. Create a new file and call it book form.jsx. Here we'll need just a couple of components from the rebus library, so we import the box and the button from it from rebus styled components. We'll also need the label and the input, but they are in another library called rebus forms styled components. So we import label, input, those are styled versions of the regular label and input elements from at rebus forms. And then we import the use form, because I'm going to be using React hook form to make it easier to work with the book form that we're having here. It's a hook from React hook form. And we also need the loader, because the server is working quite slow. But that's intentional. Import loader from React loader spinner. Now let's export our component. Export const book form equals a function that will receive the default values. The idea is that the book form is going to be used both on the update book page and create book page. Of course, for the creation of the new book, you don't need the default values. The inputs can be empty and it's fine. But when you update the book, you will need the default values. And to abstract this knowledge, this responsibility from the book form itself, we create a prop default values, which we can pass from the page that is responsible for updating or creating the book. In our case, updating. So the default values and also the onForm submit function. And also we need the isLoading flag. The thing is, as we abstract the actual book creation or updating to the page, the query or mutation that we'll use there will be providing us with the isLoading flag. And we can show it on the submit button, but we need to get this isLoading value and we pass it through the props. So we define a function, we'll use React hook form, so we get the register and handle submit from it. Handle submit from equals use form, and we pass the default values there. If the default values will be undefined, the form will be just empty, the initial state will be empty for it. Now we define the onSubmit function, onSubmit equals handle submit, the function from the React hook form. And here we pass a callback, which will get the data. This is where React hook form comes very handy. We just get the data from the form. And as the data will already be in the format that we expect, the input names will match the names of the fields in the expected object. We can just pass it to the onForm submit function. OnForm submit, and we pass the data to it. That's it. Now let's define the layout. Return, of course it needs to be a form, and as a non-submit handler, we pass our onSubmit function. Now inside of it, we render the box, and this box will be a container for the label and an input. So we specify the style sx equals margin bottom 3. Inside of the box, we use the label, which will say title, and the HTML4 field for this label should be title, because that's going to be the ID of our input. And then we define the input. We pass the ref register. It's needed because the React hook form library uses the references to the actual DOM elements to be able to control them. And that's what we're doing here. We pass the register to all the inputs that we're going to be using in this form. Ref register ID equals title. Name also equals title. This field is going to affect the name of the field inside of the data object, and we need it to be title. And the type is going to be text. Now we can copy this box or another input that is going to be called author. It should say author as well. The ref should be register, the ID should be author, and the name should be author, and the type should be text. It's fine. And finally we have a button to submit this form. Button, let's add the closing tag. This button will check if we're loading, basically the same way as the removal button. It's going to check if is loading. If it's loading, then we use the loader. Actually, it's a good idea to create another component that would incorporate this logic. And maybe it's a good homework for you if you're going to repeat the actions in this video. So we use the loader with type 3 dots and color FFF and height 10. As you can see, it's exactly the same values as in previous button that was removing items. Otherwise, it should say submit. Okay, let's fix the typos and close the tag. Format the document. All right, the form is ready, but it's not gonna do anything on its own. We need to use it now inside of the book updation page. Let's start with the update book. Go to update book component. Let's export a new component, export const update book equals a function. For now, return null. Let's go back to the app. Make sure that we've imported the update book component. That's good. And this page is responsible for updating the value. So it's going to contain both the query and the mutation. So it's an interesting case. So first of all, we need to get the ID. And as you remember, inside of the app.js, we have this segment here. So React Router DOM allows us to get this part of the segment, which in our case is called ID, by using the useParams hook. So we define an ID constant, and we use the destructuring assignment here, because we're going to get an object that will also, in our case, there are not going to be others, but there will be this ID param. Use params, and we need to import them from the React Router DOM. Import use params from React Router DOM. We'll also need to have the history, because after we update the book, we want to navigate back to the index where we have the list of all the books. So we get the history equals use history. That's another hook from React Router DOM. Use history. After we have it, we can start about thinking how do we fetch the data about the book, because we need the default values. Let's define the const that will have the data error is loading status and is error. We get it using the use query. We've already used this hook on the index page. Use query book, that's the name of the cache, and we pass an ID, the object with an ID, to our function that will fetch the book information. And then as a second argument, we pass the get book function. So here's the difference between the books list, where we pass only the string because we didn't need any additional params, and in the update book use query, we pass an array. That's another possible syntax. You can pass the cache name, it should be first, the key, and then you can pass the object with the additional params. In our case, we only need to pass the ID to the getBook function. By the way, let's go to the API and define this function. Export const getBook equals an async function that gets the query key, which in our case is going to be an array, and we're going to destructure it by doing like this, const underscore key. I'm using an underscore here to signify that we're not going to use it. It's going to be an unused variable. So we also need to specify a special comment for ESLint so it doesn't create a warning. ESLint disable no unused vars, and we close the comment. Next value was an object with a field ID equals query key. So we destructure the query key, we get the key itself, which is the book, the string book, but we are not going to use it. And we get the ID, which we are going to use. Then we get the response. The response we get using the await fetch. Here we use a template string. We use the process env react app API server. We pass in the books URL, and then we also pass the ID, which we got from the query key. We don't need to provide any additional options because that's the default GET request. We are getting the data from the server. After we have the response, we can check if it's okay, or rather if it's not okay. If not, response okay. Then we throw new error where we pass the response JSON message as a value. If everything is fine, we just return response JSON. By the way, as you can see, the code for handling the errors or passing down the JSON is going to be very similar for almost all the functions here. So maybe it's a good idea to think how could we implement a wrapping function or some sort of decorator to be able to not repeat ourselves and keep our code dry. That might be another homework for this video. Or maybe I will record another video about it myself. After we have this function, let's go back to the update book page and import it get book from API. Now we need to handle the isLoading state, if is loading. And here I'm gonna just reuse the same code that we used in the books list. I'm gonna just copy it from there. And actually it's a good sign that we need the whole layout for the loader, that is gonna be centered, properly and have proper settings. Update book, and let's use it here. Format the document, and don't forget to return your layout. Now, if something is wrong and we get an error, let's have another check here, is error. Then we do almost the same, but instead of the loader, we're gonna show error, and then we render the error message. And if it's not loading and it's not error, we don't have the error from the server, then we return the following layout. We return a container with a box inside of it. This box has an additional style property here. We need to have a vertical padding 3, and then it has a heading. It is just a text heading, some big text with style, margin bottom 3, and a closing tag. And this heading is gonna be saying update book. We don't add this heading to the shared form because we're also gonna be using this form on the create book page. So the heading belongs to the page itself, not the form. And then we use the book form default values is data. We got it from the use query, this one. Let's close the tag. We also need to pass the on form submit, and we need to define a function for it. Let's do it now. Before all the checks, we define a constant on form submit. It's gonna be an async function that will receive the data, and it needs to send it to the backend. To be able to send the data to the backend, we have the mutations. So let's define one. Const mutate async. You should be already familiar with it because we've used it to remove the books in the book item component here. We'll also need the isLoading state, but here's the problem. We already have the isLoading flag from the use query. I think good idea here would be to rename it. IsLoading will be called isMutating. And then we call use mutation, and we pass the update book function to it. And let's add the missing imports. We need to import the use query, use mutation from React query. We need to import the visual elements, the box, the heading, and the flex container from rebus styled components. And we also need to import the book form and the container from the shared components. To be able to import both of them like this from the shared, I'm gonna add an index file to the shared folder, index.js, and then I'm gonna export everything from container. Export everything from book form, and actually export everything from navbar. So now we'll be able to just say export those modules from the shared, and we don't need to specify that the book form comes from the book form module. We can just say that they're stored in the shared folder. All right, we have the imports, but we don't have the update book function. First, we need to define it in the API module. Let's export a new constant called update book. It's an async function that will get the data, its ID, and all other fields. So we spread the object, we get the ID field separately, and everything else is in the data object. It's a function, we get the response, await, fetch. We fetch the process env React App API server, books, ID. This is why we destructured this object to get the ID first. And then we need to pass an options object. It needs to contain the method. In our case, it's put because we're updating the data, not creating the new entity. Then we have the headers, content type, application, JSON. This way we tell the server that we're gonna send the JSON. And then the body is gonna be JSON, stringify, data. We transform the object into a string, stringify it. Now, if the response is not okay, response not ok, then we throw new error and we pass the response, JSON, message to it. Otherwise, we return response, JSON. Let's go to the update book page, and from the API, also import the update book function. After we did it, inside of the onFormSubmit function, we can await, mutate async, and this will actually perform the update book. We pass the object with the data that we got from the form, but it won't contain the ID. So we get the ID from the params. And after we do it, we call the history push, and we navigate to the root. Now we need to pass the onFormSubmit to our book form. OnFormSubmit equals onFormSubmit. And we also need to pass the isLoading state. So until the mutation is really done, we want to share the preloader. in our form, and it supports this functionality. So let's pass the is mutating format the document, and it should be fine. One thing that we forgot to import is a loader. Import loader from React loader spinner. Okay, let's try it out. If we click on one of those books, for example, Programming Perls, and then we add, I don't know, something to the author name, submit, we go back, and the author is updated. Let's fix it back. We remove this, submit, we get a nice loader on the bottom, and everything is fine. The only functionality that is left is to be able to create the new books. Okay, let's define this component. Go to create book folder, create book file, and let's import a bunch of things. First of all, we'll need the book form. Import book form. And also a container component. I'm gonna import it now just because it's convenient. We're importing them both from the shared. From shared. Speaking of components, we'll also need the box and the heading from rebase styled components. Okay, so in this page, create book, we only need to use the mutation. In the update book page, we needed both the default values, so we used the query to query the data. And here we need only to mutate the data. We need to create the book from scratch. So let's define it. Const mutate async and is loading. Use mutation, blips, bloops. And we need to use the create book function from the API. That doesn't exist there yet. So let's import the use mutation. Import use mutation from React query. And let's define the create book function. Inside of the API module, let's export const create book equals async. The only thing that we need here is data, and it's a function where we get the response using await, fetch. We use the process env. We get the environment variable called React app API server, books, and just slash. We don't need to pass any sort of ID. We don't know it yet. We're just gonna create the new book. Then we specify the options object. The method is post because we're creating a new entity. The headers is an object with a field, content type, application, and JSON, because we tell the server that we're gonna send the JSON body. And then the body is JSON stringify data, just like we did when we updated the book. Now we check if response is not okay, and then we throw a new error, response JSON message. Maybe it would make a good video if I would refactor this part and create some reusable piece of code that we would implement in that vid. And if everything is fine, we return a response JSON. Now that we have our create book function, we can go back to create book component, import the create book from API, format the document, and now we can return a layout. We use container to wrap the whole page. Inside of this container, we use a box with some additional padding. 6 equals padding y, vertical padding 3. And inside of this box, we render a heading that will say create new book. So we can immediately see what are we going to do with the book here, update or create. And then we pass a book form. On form submit, we need to define this function. Const on form submit equals a function, which is async, by the way, because we're going to use the mutate async there. It's a function where we call the await mutate async, and we pass the data. After we do it, we need to navigate back to the root. So we'll need the history object, const history equals use history. Did we import it? No, we did not. Let's import use history from React router DOM. Okay, we have the history. Now, after we successfully mutated, we've created the book, we can navigate back to the root. History, push, root. Now we can pass this on form submit as a prop to our book form, on form submit. And the is loading, which we didn't have to rename to is mutating, as an is loading prop, is loading. Let's add some additional styles to the heading. 6 equals margin bottom 3 and format the document. I'm using the data here, but I'm not getting it anywhere. I forgot to use it in the arguments. So we get it from the arguments from the book form, pass it to the mutate async function, and then navigate to the root. Let's try test, 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 book, author, Maxim, submit, okay. And we have it here. Now we can remove it. And that means that we are done. Our app is working. We have an app with a list of books where we can create new books, and the author name, submit. We have preloaders on every action. We can edit the book with the default values, and then we change them to something else. Submit. We can remove the books, and that means we have a complete CRUD application. Create, read, update, delete. Thank you for watching. All the related materials for this video, the server, the client code, all the examples are in the video description. If you have any questions, then leave them in the comments, or you can join my Discord server and we can discuss this tutorial there. Also, I have a small announcement. I had an idea that video tutorials and articles are great at teaching, but they don't provide the necessary practice. You can repeat after the author and maybe give your own twist to the apps, but what if there would be some resource where you could get an assignment and do it on your own completely, and then there are two options. Maybe you get a feedback, or maybe you just make sure that all the tests pass. So for the first assignment, I just wrote some tests that automatically check that your solution works. The link will also be in the description, and I'm going to try to make it a newsletter. So if you follow that link, you will see the first issue of this newsletter, and I think somewhere on the screen will be a subscribe button as well. So if you want to get more newsletters like this, you can subscribe. Anyway, if you check out the first newsletter, the first letter, it's actually not even a letter, it's a web page, and you like the idea or you have any ideas on how to improve it, then reach out to me in Discord, or if you know or through email, and let's talk about it. Okay, see you next time, and let's keep in touch.